I never thought much about the Cold War growing up. It was just something in history books, you know? But last November, it became all too real for me and my family. We just bought this old house from the 1960s. It needed work, but the price was right, and my wife Maggie loved its vintage charm. Our kids were excited about having a big backyard. The previous owner, Mrs. Goldstein, was this sweet old lady who'd lived there for decades. She told us the house had some quirks, but we figured that was normal for an older place. About a month after moving in, I was in the basement trying to fix a leaky pipe. I noticed this weird patch on the wall that didn't match the rest. When I tapped it, it sounded hollow. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started chipping away at the plaster. That's when I found a heavy metal door, hidden behind the wall. It took some effort, but I managed to get it open. The hinges creaked like they hadn't been used in years. Inside was a fallout shelter. It was like stepping back in time. There were old canned goods, water jugs, a radio, even some board games. But something felt off. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, except for one corner. There was a cot with relatively clean blankets and some empty food cans that looked newer than the rest. I called Maggie down to take a look. She was fascinated, talking about how we could turn it into a wine cellar or something. But I couldn't do away with this uneasy feeling. That night I found it hard to sleep. I kept thinking about that shelter. Why hide it? And why did it look like someone had been using it recently? The next day I asked our neighbor, Mr. Sahid, if he knew anything about it. He's lived on the street for years. His face went pale when I mentioned the shelter. He mumbled something about how some things are better left alone, and quickly went back inside. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things. Our tools would be in different places than where we left them. Food would go missing from the pantry. Small things, easy to dismiss, but they added up. One night, I heard noises coming from the basement. I went to check, thinking it might be mice. As I got closer to the shelter door, the noises stopped. But I was definitely sure I heard someone breathing on the other side. I didn't tell Maggie. I didn't want to scare her. But I started doing some digging personally. Without much effort, I found a series of disappearances from the 1980s to the early 2000s from an old newspaper. People who just vanished without a trace. The last disappearance was in 2005. A teenager named Christopher. They never found him. But get this, his best friend was Mrs. Goldstein's grandson. I didn't get this information directly from her, though. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Was there a connection? Had Mrs. Goldstein been hiding something or someone all these years? I decided to stake out the basement one night. I told Maggie I was working late and hid in a corner near the shelter. Hours passed. I was about to give up when I heard it, the sound of the shelter door slowly opening. A figure emerged, tall, thin, pale from lack of sunlight. He moved like he was unused to open spaces. When he turned, I saw his face. He couldn't have been more than 35, but his eyes, they looked ancient. I must have made a noise because he suddenly looked right at me. For a moment we just stared at each other. Then he spoke. His voice was raspy, like he wasn't used to talking. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. I didn't know what to do. I asked him who he was, what he was doing in my house. He just shook his head. "This was never your house," he said. "It's always been ours, our shelter, our prison." He told me his name was Christopher. Yes, that Christopher. He'd been living in the shelter for almost 20 years. Mrs. Goldstein had been protecting him, bringing him food and supplies. But why? What was he hiding from? Christopher's story was hard to believe. He talked about a group that had infiltrated the area some years ago. People in positions of power who weren't what they seemed. He and his friend had stumbled onto their secret, and he'd been hiding ever since. I really found it hard to believe what he was saying and wanted to dismiss it as the ravings of a madman. But then I remembered Mr. Saheed's reaction, the missing people, the way Mrs. Goldstein had been so eager to sell the house after all these years. She literally print new flyers every weekend, try to make sure she sell the house. Christopher begged me not to tell anyone he was there. He said it wasn't safe, that they were still out there, waiting. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just let him keep living in my basement. But if what he was saying was true... In the end, I made a decision. I told my wife everything. At first she was shocked, scared, and not quite at peace with the guy staying in our basement at all. You know how women can be so frightened. After much deliberation, thinking back and forth, we agreed to help Christopher, but on our terms. We'd find a way to verify his story, to see if there was any truth to this conspiracy he feared. It's been a few months now. Christopher's slowly adjusting to life above ground. We've been careful, watching for any signs that his fears are justified. And you know what? We've seen things. Little things that don't add up. People in town who seem to watch us a little too closely. I don't know where this will lead, but I do know one thing. Our quiet little town isn't what it seems. And that fallout shelter? It wasn't protecting us from nuclear war. It was hiding us from a threat much closer to home. Sometimes, I just find myself looking over my shoulder, wondering who I can really trust. Because now I know the most dangerous secrets aren't buried in underground bunkers. They're hiding in plain sight, in the smiles of our neighbors and the handshakes of our leaders. And as for Mrs. Goldstein, we finally tracked her down in a retirement community a few towns over. When we confronted her, she just gave us a sad smile and said, "I'm sorry. I thought I was protecting everyone. I never meant for it to go on this long." I was speechless at her word. Now, every time I pass that shelter door, I wonder, what other secrets is this town hiding? And more importantly, what are we going to do about it? I thought uncovering Christopher's story would be the end of it. But it was just the beginning. After we confronted Mrs. Goldstein, things in town started to change. People we'd known for years began acting strangely. Our neighbors, the Saheed's family, suddenly moved away without saying goodbye. The local sheriff, who'd always been friendly, now watched our house with suspicious eyes. One night I found a note slipped under our door. It read, "You're digging too deep. For your family's safety, stop now." The handwriting looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. We debated what to do. Maggie wanted to go to the authorities, but I wasn't sure who we could trust anymore. That's when Christopher suggested something crazy. We should use the fallout shelter as our base of operations. "They don't know I'm here," he said. "We can use that to our advantage." So we started our own investigation. Christopher taught us how to move around town unnoticed, how to gather information without raising suspicion. We discovered a pattern in the disappearances. They all happened around the same time every year, always when the town's annual festival was in full swing. But the real breakthrough came when Joseph, my son, found an old photo album in the attic. It was full of pictures from festivals dating back decades. In every single one, standing in the background, was the same man. He didn't age, He didn't change. It was impossible, but there he was. We showed the album to Christopher. His face went white. "That's him," he whispered. "That's the man who's been after me all these years." We decided to confront this mystery man at the upcoming festival. All these leaps was quite risky for me, considering the fact that I have a family to protect, but we needed answers. The night of the festival arrived, and the town was buzzing with activity. We split up, each of us looking for the man from the photos. I was the one who found him. He was standing by the old clock tower, watching the crowd with cold eyes. When he saw me approaching, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "I've been waiting for you, Nelson," he said. "You and your family have caused quite a stir." He told me a story that chilled me to the bone. Our town wasn't just a town, it was a feeding ground. Every year during the festival, certain individuals were harvested. Their life force used to keep him and others like him young and powerful. "Your grandfather discovered our secret," he said. "We let him live in exchange for his silence and a promise that his family would always remain in town, providing a steady supply of potential harvests. Your coming here wasn't a mistake, or by coincidence. We drew you here as a fulfillment of your father's promise to us." I felt sick. All these years, my family had been unwitting accomplices to this horror. I became more terrified at the hearing of the story and who he is. But then, as I was ruminating on what to do, I saw something that made my heart leap. Maggie, giving me a signal. While I'd been talking to the man, she and Christopher had been setting up a trap. In that moment, everything happened at once. The festival lights went out. There was a flash and a strange humming noise. When the lights came back on, the man was on the ground, writhing in pain. Christopher stepped forward, holding some kind of device. "It disrupts their energy field," he explained, "turns their own power against them." He was overpowered, and we turned him over to the police, together with the recording I did with my phone while talking to him. The recorded conversation was enough for him to be incriminated. We'd done it. We'd exposed the truth and stopped the harvests. But our victory came at a cost. As word spread, people panicked. Some fled town. Others turned on their neighbors, unsure who to trust. In the chaos that followed, we made a decision. We couldn't stay. There were others like that man out there, and they'd be coming for us now. So we packed up, said goodbye to the town, and hit the road without looking back. I've been a farmer all my life, just like my dad and his dad before him. Our family's been working this land for generations. But what happened last November? Well, it shook everything I thought I knew about our farm and this town. It started during the late harvest. We'd had some trouble with our equipment earlier in the season, so we were behind schedule. I was out in the field one evening, trying to get as much done as I could before the weather turned. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I remember thinking how beautiful it was, even as I was cursing the fading light. That's when I first heard it. James. I looked around, thinking maybe my wife Linda had come out to check on me. But there was no one there. Just rows and rows of corn, stretching out as far as I could see. I shrugged it off and went back to work. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. "James, listen." It sounded like it was coming from the corn itself. Now, I'm not the kind of man who believes in ghosts or anything like that. I figured I was just tired, maybe dehydrated. So I took a break, had some water, and tried to clear my head. But it kept happening. Every night I was out there, I'd hear my name called. Sometimes it was just a whisper. Other times it sounded urgent, almost panicked. I didn't tell Linda at first. I didn't want her to think I was losing my mind. But then the equipment started acting up. The tractor would shut off for no reason, always in the same spot in the field. The harvester would jam, but only when it reached a certain row. It was like the corn was trying to stop us from harvesting those areas. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I do. But sincerely, that's what it felt like. I really don't know any other definition to give it. After about a week of this, I couldn't take it anymore. I told Linda everything. I expected her to laugh or tell me to see a doctor. But she got real quiet and then asked me something I'll never forget. "James," she said, "do you remember the story your grandpa used to tell? About the old burial ground?" I did remember, vaguely. Grandpa used to talk about how this land was sacred to the Native Americans who lived here long ago. He'd say we needed to respect the land, that it had a memory longer than any of us could imagine. As kids, we thought it was just one of Grandpa's stories. But now, Linda suggested we talk to Mr. Sawyer, the town historian. He's been around forever, knows all the local legends and such. So we went to see him the next day. Mr. Sawyer listened to our story without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded slowly and said, "I was wondering when this day would come." He told us that our farm sits on what used to be a sacred site for the Potawatomi tribe. They believed it was a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where they could communicate with their ancestors. But, Mr. Sawyer said, something happened. A massacre. The details are fuzzy, lost to time, but the land remembers. He thought that maybe, just maybe, the spirits were trying to communicate, that they were protecting something buried in those fields. I'll be honest, part of me wanted to dismiss it all. Spirits? Ancient massacres? It sounded like something out of a movie, but I couldn't ignore what was happening. It was really frustrating. So Linda and I made a decision. We called in an archaeologist friend of ours. We told her we suspected there might be Native American artifacts on our land and asked if she'd take a look. She was excited about the possibility. She brought in some equipment, including ground-penetrating radar. And you know what? She found something. In the exact spots where the equipment had been malfunctioning, where the whispers seemed loudest, there were anomalies underground. She couldn't say for sure what they were, but she was pretty certain they weren't natural formations. Word got out about what we'd found. Before we knew it, representatives from the Potawatomi Nation were at our door. They were respectful but firm. This land was important to their people, they said. They asked for permission to investigate further. Of course, we agreed. Over the next few weeks, our farm became a hive of activity. Archaeologists, tribal elders, and even a few reporters came and went. They found remains, hundreds of years old, and artifacts too, pottery, tools, things I can't even name. The tribal representatives said it confirmed old stories passed down through generations about a settlement that had been wiped out. As they worked, the whispers stopped. The equipment problems cleared up. It was like the land was satisfied that its message had finally been heard. We ended up donating that part of our land to the Potawatomi Nation. It felt like the right thing to do. They're working on turning it into a memorial site now. My grandpa used to say that the land tells us what it needs. If only we'd listen. To be honest, I never really understood what he meant until now. I've been a long-haul trucker for about 11.5 years now, and I thought I'd seen it all. Weird roadside attractions, sketchy diners, you name it. But what happened to me last November? Well, it's something I'm still trying to wrap my head around. I was on a run from Chicago to Seattle, hauling a load of electronics. The weather had been nasty all day. Heavy snow, winds that made my rig sway. I'd planned to make it to Billings before stopping, but by the time I hit eastern Montana, I knew I needed to call it a night. That's when I saw the sign for the Pine View Motel, next exit. It wasn't on my usual route, but beggars can't be choosers in a snowstorm. The motel was this old place, probably built in the 60s. Paint peeling, neon sign flickering. But it was shelter. And that's all I cared about. The guy at the front desk, let's call him Earl, was a character. Looked about 90, with a beard down to his chest and thick glasses that magnified his eyes. He kept muttering about how I was lucky to get the last room. Now, I'm not trying to be funny, but the parking lot was empty except for my rig and Earl's ancient pickup. Last room? Yeah, right. Anyway, I got to my room, number 13, of course, and it was pretty much what you'd expect. Faded wallpaper, lumpy bed, and this massive mirror covering one wall. I remember thinking it was an odd choice for such a small room. I was beat, so I just dropped my bags and flopped on the bed. As I was rolling on the bed, suddenly I noticed something weird in the mirror. The reflection showed a digital alarm clock on the nightstand, glowing red in the dim light. But when I turned to look at the actual nightstand, there was no clock. At first, I thought I was just tired. But when I got up to take a closer look, and that's when things got really strange. In the mirror, the room looked different, newer. The wallpaper was a different pattern. The bedspread was a different color. And my reflection, it moved a split second after I did, like there was a delay. I stumbled back, blinking hard. This couldn't be real. I must have been more exhausted than I thought. I decided to splash some water on my face, but when I went into the bathroom, the mirror there showed the old, dingy room I'd walked into. I looked back at the big mirror, and it still showed the newer version. At that instant, I heard a knock at the door. My first thought was that it was Earl, maybe coming to check if everything was okay. But when I opened the door, there was no one there. Just the empty walkway and the snow falling beyond. I closed the door, turning back to the room, and nearly jumped out of my skin. There, sitting on the bed, was a woman. She looked to be in her 30s with long dark hair and a confused expression. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "How did you get in here?" She looked right at me, but didn't seem to hear me. Instead, she got up and walked towards the mirror. I backed away, not sure what was happening. As she approached the mirror, I saw her reflection do something impossible. It reached out as if to touch the glass, but its hand came through. Actually came through the mirror. The woman screamed, and I'm not ashamed to admit, so did I. She ran out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I stood there frozen, staring at the mirror. The room in the reflection flickered, like a TV with bad reception, between the newer version and the old one I was standing in. I grabbed my things and ran to the front desk, ready to demand answers from Earl. But the lobby was empty. No Earl, no guest book, nothing. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. I got in my rig and drove, snowstorm be damned. I didn't stop until I hit the next town, where I pulled into a busy truck stop, surrounded by other drivers and the comforting sounds of idling engines. It was such an out-of-the-world experience for me. I did some digging about it then. Turns out, there have been stories about that motel for years. People reporting strange experiences, always involving the mirrors. Some say they saw different versions of themselves. Others claim they saw loved ones who had passed away. There's this theory going around online about parallel universes, how there might be infinite versions of reality, all existing at once. Some people think that in certain places, like that motel, the barriers between these universes get thin, that you can sometimes see through to another version of the world. I don't know if I believe all that, but I know what I saw. And I can't help but wonder about the woman I saw. Did she somehow cross over into another reality? Is she still out there, in some other version of our world? I still drive that route sometimes, though I always make sure to stop well before or after where the hotel should be. I haven't told many people this story. It sounds crazy, I know. But I figure, in a world where you can talk to someone on the other side of the planet with a device in your pocket, who's to say what's really impossible? I never planned to become a marine biologist. Growing up in a small coastal town in Oregon, I was more interested in video games than the ocean. But life has a funny way of steering you places you never expected. My name's Megan, and last November I found myself studying coastal erosion patterns along the Pacific Northwest. It was supposed to be a straightforward research project. Instead, it turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. It all started when I stumbled upon an old lighthouse while surveying a particularly remote stretch of coastline. The place looked abandoned, paint peeling and windows boarded up. But something about it caught my eye. I'd always been a bit of a history buff, so I decided to take a closer look. That's when I noticed the door was slightly ajar. Now, I know what you're thinking. Going into an abandoned building alone is a bad idea. But curiosity got the better of me. Inside, it was like stepping back in time. Old equipment scattered about, cobwebs everywhere. But what really caught my attention was a dusty old logbook sitting on a desk. I picked it up, thinking it might have some interesting historical information. Boy, was I in for a surprise. The log started normally enough. Daily weather reports, ship sightings, that sort of thing. But as I flipped through the pages, the entries started to get weird. The keeper, a man named Wildmore, wrote about seeing strange lights in the water. At first, he dismissed them as bioluminescent algae. But then he started describing creatures. Massive, impossible creatures is emerging from the depths. Now, I've studied marine biology for years. I know what lives in these waters. What Wildmore was describing, it didn't match anything in the scientific record. I should have put the book down right then. Should have walked away and never looked back. But I couldn't. It was like the words had hooked me, pulling me deeper into Wildmore's world. As I read on, the entries got more frantic. Wildmore wrote about the creatures getting closer, about strange noises echoing across the water at night. He was convinced something big was coming. The final entry was dated November 15, 1997. It simply read, "They're here." I closed the book, feeling a sense of fright run through me. It was just the ramblings of a lonely lighthouse keeper, right? Probably driven a bit mad by isolation. That's what I told myself as I left the lighthouse and headed back to my research station. Obviously, I couldn't give a logical explanation, so I tied it to that. But that night, as I was reviewing my coastal survey data, I noticed something abnormal. There was a pattern in the erosion that didn't make sense. It looked almost like claw marks, huge claw marks, gouged into the coastline. I tried to rationalize it. Underwater landslides, maybe, or some quirk of ocean currents. But a nagging voice in the back of my mind kept whispering, what if Wildmore was right? The next day I went back to the lighthouse. I needed to know more about Wildmore, but when I got there, the place was swarming with people. Hazmat suits, government vehicles, the works. A stern-looking woman who introduced herself as Agent Carter approached me. She asked what I was doing there. I fumbled through an explanation about my research project. She nodded, then said something that made my blood run cold. I'm going to need you to come with me, Dr. Thompson. We need to talk about what you saw in that logbook. How did she know about the logbook? Or about me seeing it? I hadn't told anyone. The next few hours were a blur. I was taken to a makeshift command center they'd set up nearby. There I met Dr. Elias, a marine biologist I'd admired for years. He looked tired, worried. Megan, he said, what I'm about to tell you is classified, but given what you've stumbled into, you need to know. He explained that Wildmore wasn't crazy. The creatures he saw were real. Some kind of ancient species that spent most of its time in the deep ocean. But every few decades they'd come to the surface to, well, no one was quite sure. Feed? Breed? Something else entirely? We've been tracking their movements for years, Dr. Elias said, and according to our calculations, they're due to surface again. Soon. That's when it hit me. The erosion patterns I'd been studying, they weren't natural. They were signs of these creatures moving closer to shore. Over the next few days, I worked with Dr. Elias and his team. We analyzed data, compared notes with Wildmore's log, tried to predict where and when these creatures might appear. And then on the night of November 15th, exactly 27 years after Wildmore's last entry, it happened. We were out on a research vessel, monitoring underwater sensors. Suddenly, all the equipment went haywire. The water around us started to churn, and then we saw it. A massive shape rising from the depths. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, tentacles the size of redwood trees, eyes bigger than cars, glowing with an otherworldly intelligence. For a moment, it just looked at us. I felt small, insignificant, like an ant staring up at a human. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it sank back into the ocean. The whole encounter lasted maybe a minute, but it changed everything. In the days that followed, similar sightings were reported up and down the coast. The government tried to cover it up, of course. Swamp gas, mass hallucination, all the usual excuses. But those of us who were there, we know the truth. I'm still a marine biologist, still studying the coast. But now, I'm part of a special team. Our job is to monitor these creatures, to try and understand them, to prepare for their next emergence. Sometimes, late at night, I think about Wildmore, about how he must have felt, alone in that lighthouse, watching these impossible beings rise from the sea. I wonder if he knew that decades later, his log would help us understand what we were facing. And I wonder what else is out there, in the vast, unexplored depths of our oceans. What other secrets are waiting to be discovered? So to everyone listening to my story, the next time you're at the beach, picnic, hiking, or anywhere close to water and you see something strange out on the horizon, bear this in mind. The ocean is vast, and we've only scratched the surface of its mysteries. Who knows what might be looking back at you from beneath the waves? I've been a nurse for over a decade now, working at St. Mary's Hospital in a small town you've probably never heard of. It's not a glamorous job, but it's always been rewarding. At least, it was until last November, when everything I thought I knew about medicine and life itself got turned upside down. My name's Rachel, and I've always preferred the night shift. It's quieter, and I feel like I can really focus on my patients. Plus, let's be honest, the extra pay doesn't hurt. My husband jokes that I'm part vampire, but he's always been supportive of my odd hours. It all started on a pretty typical Tuesday night. I came in for my shift, got my assignments from the day nurse, Betty. She mentioned that Mr. Torsten in room 305 wasn't doing so well. He'd been battling late-stage cancer, and things weren't looking good. I went to check on Mr. Torsten first. He was asleep, but his vitals were weak. I adjusted his meds and made a note to keep a close eye on him. As I was leaving his room, I bumped into Dr. Patel. He's this brilliant young doctor who'd recently joined our staff. Always friendly, but that night he seemed off, distracted. When I asked if he was okay, he just mumbled something about needing coffee and hurried off. The rest of the night was pretty routine, checking vitals, administering meds, the usual. But when I went back to Mr. Torsten's room around 3 a.m., I couldn't believe what I was seeing. His color had improved dramatically. His breathing was stronger. Even his latest blood work showed significant improvement. It was like he'd gotten months of treatment in just a few hours. I called Dr. Patel immediately. He rushed over, looking as shocked as I felt. We spent the next hour running tests, trying to figure out what had happened. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Patel said, shaking his head. "It's almost miraculous. I should have been thrilled, and part of me was, but another part felt uneasy. Something about this just didn't add up." Over the next few weeks, I started noticing a pattern. Patients who were struggling would show remarkable improvement during my shifts, but when I'd come back the next night, they'd have declined again. At first, I thought maybe I was just imagining things, but then I started keeping detailed notes, comparing them with the day shift reports. The difference was undeniable. I tried talking to Betty about it, but she just laughed it off. "Sounds like you've got the magic touch, Rachel," she said. "Maybe we should call you Florence Nightingale." But I knew it wasn't me. Something else was going on. I decided to do some digging. I started looking into the hospital's patient records and anything that might give me a clue. Eventually, I found something. Something strange, though. Every few decades, there were reports of unexplained recoveries at St. Mary's. They'd last for a few months, then stop as suddenly as they started. The most recent had been about 30 years ago. I was so focused on my research that I almost didn't notice Dr. Patel standing behind me. "Find anything interesting?" he asked, making me jump. I hesitated, then decided to tell him everything. To my surprise, he didn't seem shocked. Instead, he looked relieved. "I thought I was going crazy," he said, sinking into a chair. "I've been seeing it too. patients improving impossibly fast, but only at night. I couldn't explain it. We spent hours comparing notes, trying to make sense of it all. That's when Dr. Patel suggested something that seemed insane at the time. "What if," he said slowly, "something is using us to heal these patients?" I laughed, but he was dead serious. He started talking about energy fields, about old legends of healers who could channel some kind of universal life force. I wanted to dismiss it all as nonsense, but after what I'd seen, could I really rule anything out? We decided to set up a little experiment. We'd monitor a patient closely all night, taking detailed readings of everything, not just vital signs, but energy levels in the room, electromagnetic fields, the works. The patient we chose was Mrs. Martinez, an elderly woman recovering from a stroke. Her progress had been slow, but steady. That night, as we watched the monitors, something incredible happened. There was a spike in electromagnetic activity around 2 a.m., and at that exact moment, Mrs. Martinez's brainwaves changed. It was like her brain was rewiring itself, healing at an accelerated rate. But here's the weird part. At the same time, I felt drained, like something was pulling energy out of me. Dr. Patel said he felt it too. Over the next few weeks, we repeated the experiment with different patients. The results were always the same. Patients would improve dramatically, but Dr. Patel and I would end up exhausted. We were helping people, yes, but at what cost? I started having nightmares, dreams where I was being drained completely, turned into a husk. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like something had been watching me. Dr. Patel was struggling too. He was losing weight, looking more haggard every day. "We need to stop," he said one night. "Whatever this is, it's taking too much from us." But how could we stop? How could we deny our patients this chance at healing? That's when I remembered something my grandmother used to say. She was a healer in her village back in Ireland, using old remedies and what some might call magic. She always said that healing was a gift, but it required balance. Take too much, give too much, and the scales would tip. I realized that's what was happening here. Whatever force was healing our patients, it was taking too much from us in return. We needed to find a way to balance it. It took weeks of research, of trial and error. We looked into energy work, into meditation techniques, into ways to protect ourselves while still allowing the healing to happen. Slowly, we found a balance. We learned to channel the energy without being drained by it, to act as conduits rather than batteries. The miraculous recoveries slowed down, became less dramatic, but they were sustainable now. And Dr. Patel and I, we were okay. We never told anyone else the full story. How could we? But we did start a program at the hospital, teaching patients and staff about energy work, about the power of the mind in healing. Most think it's just some New Age wellness thing, but Dr. Patel and I know the truth.